Hi, everybody. Prospect. So, well, let me say that, first off, thank you, Jens. Thank you, Alicia. Thank you, Greg. Thank you, everybody from MOCAD. It's good to be here. It's been a long time since I've been in Detroit, and it's really nice to see familiar faces in the crowd as well. We just opened an exhibition in Los Angeles at LACMA 2 weeks ago on an artist named Noah Purifoy. And people keep saying that it's sort of apropos of the moment because Purifoy is an artist who worked with social activism and also was an artist. And I think, you know, with what's happening in the last 6 months or whatever, it can be read that way, but it's amazing how it would have been just as apropos not so long ago. Can you hear me? Okay. So with that in mind, it's nice to come back to Prospect, but that is also to say that you're getting me on Prospect 5 months after it closed, and so I'm trying to retake it in again, and it reminds me of the fact that what was at the core of Prospect probably has even more to do with this sort of moment that we're in. And I have way too many images, as sometimes we are wont to do curatorially, and I'm gonna try and walk through the ideas behind the exhibition and then show you some of the work. And I think that it goes towards a discussion on how a show like that happens and how there might be some sort of parallels or something interesting in the context of here. And I guess let me see, there's a bunch of things. I was like, seriously, like, we just opened this show, so I've been thinking about Purifoy nonstop ever since Prospect opened, so I'm trying to think through my notes again. But one of the things I want to note in the sense of Purifoy, I should say that he was an assemblage artist who was born in Alabama in 1917, moved to LA in the early 50s, was the first African-American or black artist to matriculate at Cal Arts, or what was then called Chenard. And he worked right under Simon Rodia's Watts Towers. So he came from this place, I think, where vernacular art was valued, where folk tradition was probably way more important than, you know, showing work in a museum. And he had that sense of practice. And I'm saying this here because I also want to say here that he has some similarities with Terri Guyton's project, with the Heidelberg project. And in fact, in the catalog that we did, Lowry Sims wrote a brilliant essay in which she managed to tie that in terms of images and in terms of the discussion. In fact, there's a beautiful spread of a piece from the Heidelberg project on one page and then shown with an image from Mississippi on the other page. So she's kind of thinking through those things, and just, I think it's important for me to think through that in terms of addressing you here and now, because I can't like do the canned talk on Prospect anymore. So I'm gonna try and walk through it and try to think through this thing. And I also want to say that, I mean, since it's up there, Prospect, as Jens mentioned, began as a way to have a conversation culturally after Katrina and after the effects of Hurricane Katrina. And it began in that way, in the same way that a lot of these type of exhibitions began. And I think I learned a lot in the process of thinking about these types of shows, and I mean these biennial type exhibitions that go back to, say, Venice, 1895, and I would say through, the Venice Biennial that's up right now. And I've had the opportunity to think through these types of exhibitions in a very specific, concentrated way. Because after leaving DIA, I went to work for Flash Art in Milan, and was there at a time, I think, 96 to 1998, when concepts around these types of exhibitions were under a lot of discussion, and perhaps I would say that the conversation opened up in a way that it had not been prior to those years. Not only did you have in that year Venice, you had Documenta as one of those years where you have all of those shows at the same time, Sculpture Project in Münster. And in addition to those European exhibitions, you also had Gwangju in Korea, you had Istanbul, Jens did Istanbul at a certain point after that. You also had the second Johannesburg biennial. And so there was a conversation that was happening that was becoming very different. And it wasn't, it wasn't only extending to these places, Africa, Asia, far away, but even more adding to the conversation in South America, which of course has already had the Sao Paulo Biennale since the mid-50s. But you had a real sense of change in the conversation. And I think that on one hand, there is something that our founder of Prospect, Dan Cameron, took from this conversation, which was that, these types of exhibitions can go some way towards having discussion after something, I don't want to say, tragic or anything, but after these events. And in the case of Venice, going all the way back, you're dealing with what was, I think, one of the first sort of artistic forays that was very much parallel to the idea of the World's Fair. We go, we have these art events, we bring people from around the world, we have pavilions that have nationalities attached to them, in order to talk to each other, in order to have a conversation and to understand about each other. Of course, the World's Fair, commerce is the engine, but this exchange is something that we see in those type of exhibitions as well. So one of the things that Dan took from that history was the idea of it being a regenerative kind of source for the city in the wake of Katrina. And he started the Prospect with that in mind, in the same way that, Documenta is a post-World War II event. Gwangju is a post-democracy movement event. And it happens in the little town of Gwangju, way down in the south, far away from Seoul, because that was where the force and power of the democracy movement was. So you had this sort of backdrop, and I think it was a prescient way in which to talk about some of the issues that already existed in New Orleans, in addition to some of the things that came about in the wake of Katrina. The one thing that I learned from being in Europe in the mid-90s and trying to think through these shows and talking to some of these curators was that they needed to do two things to be successful. And one of them was that they needed to be about where they were. They needed to have a reference point that was tied to their location and to their context. It couldn't just be a show that you do in New York, can't just be a show you do in Istanbul, and vice versa. Or, for instance, there was that idea that it had to be tied to location. And then, of course, the thing that we want to do and talk about and why these shows happen on a biennial or every 5-year or every 7-year instance, and Prospect is turning into a triennial, is because we want to revisit these things in our own moment. And so in order for the show to be successful, it has to tell you something about the last 2 years if it's a biennial, 3 years if it's triennial, etc. And so it has to be about location and about the moment. With New Orleans in mind, and with those two things in mind, I also had time to go out and just talk to artists, because at the heart of these type of exhibitions, it really is taking the temperature of, well, what are artists thinking about? What are artists doing in this moment? And so I took about almost a year that was pretty much open to just conversations with artists and curators. and trying to understand some of the things that people felt were important to contemporary artistic practice. In the course of these visits, I met a young photographer who suggested, and I should say a backdrop for me in terms of thinking through ideas curatorially has always been an interest and a reference point in literature. And so at the time, I was reading books like Chinua Achebe, Things Fall Apart. I think I was reading Zadie Smith, White Teeth. I was reading, probably importantly for me, Milan Kundera, Book of Laughter and Forgetting, and maybe even more, most importantly, Italo Calvino, Invisible Cities. And was thinking about that and talking about that in studio visits, and this woman said, you should read The Moviegoer. And I mean, I studied American literature, so I'm like, how do I not know this book? And go out and read this book, this little book that came out in 1961 by Walker Percy. And it gave me location, because it is a book that is slim and poetically describes the city and its atmosphere. I mean, literally, like, smell, everything is in there. But it's also a book that is concerned with sort of big universal ideas, for lack of a better word. Percy was steeped in the South. One of the things he liked to say was that he had a relative who was in the Confederacy and then another one who was on the Union side. And this idea of him being born in Alabama, raised in Mississippi, died in Louisiana. He had an uncle who was a poet. He spoke about meeting William Faulkner for the first time and trembling and not being able to speak. He came from this place. And yet at the same time, he had this really strong interest in existentialism. He studied at Columbia. So he had these other reference points that were outside. And I think The Moviegoer brings those things together. So I read it, and it changed my outlook, and it gave me a direction. And this is just one of the most focused quotes, and one that I used throughout the exhibition, so that at every venue there was this text greeted viewers. And it describes essentially what you're trying to do with this type of exhibition, which is, you're going on this search. And for Percy, the search is about a search for living. And so I think at the end, the idea of how do we live with each other, how do we see ourselves in each other, was what I took away from the book. The protagonist is this guy who's approaching his 30th birthday. He's back from the Korean War, so he's seen other parts of the world, unlike most of his family who never has left Louisiana. He has reference points outside that open his mind to something else. In the course of this week leading up to Mardi Gras, and then his birthday is the day after, he goes on this described search. It's a book that, as I said, it was small, and I didn't know it, of course, at the time, and I'm sure some of you don't know of the book, but it came out, it won the National Book Award in 1962. And these are the books that beat out, big books. Franny and Zooey, Catch-22, Revolutionary Road. And it's Percy's biggest book. So it gave me this reference point. And one of the reference points that I think I took, in addition to this idea of seeing each other and ourselves, was the other part of what this exhibition must do, and locating it not only in its specificity of New Orleans, but in terms of ideas. Who are we? What are we? Where are we going? And so I just kind of kept looking at that and thinking about that. And of course, the big painting from the Boston MFA by Gauguin of that title would be an interesting conversation piece, but that's a hard painting to get on loan. So I had to think through that. Like, can we carry this concept far enough? And I think it could be. But then the other question was, okay, so if you have Gauguin, you have this guy who's, often discussed as trying to find himself in other people. I mean, we talk about exotic other, but trying to find himself. He leaves Paris in the avant-garde conversation that he's very much a part of. He travels frequently. And this is also an artist who grew up traveling, was born in South America, family traveled, was exposed to things. And so I think it was easy for him to leave that conversation in some ways. And then on the other hand, well, how do we talk about this from the context of rethinking location again? So, there's a big Western canon and a history of art that I think is at the background of this exhibition, but it's wider than perhaps often told. And so it made me think about this woman, Tarsila do Amaral, who was born not too far after Gauguin, maybe 20 years after, and in Brazil, and as part of a group of artists, along with her husband, Oswald de Andrade, who were having a conversation best termed around ideas of the Cannibalist Manifesto, anthropophagia. And from that idea that in order for us to represent ourselves, to show our true selves, then we have to show all of ourselves. And for them, that meant eating the African, the native, the European, and that would be a true projection of what Brazil is at this time, and this is the 1920s, at this time when we are projecting ourselves on the world stage. So there was a historical backdrop, and this painting, Under the Pandanus, was in Dallas at the Dallas Museum of Art and had traveled the year before, was recently conserved, and put us specifically into that moment, 1891, when he first goes to Tahiti. And from there, I think there were little things that slide into place as they have to, but there was a connection with Gauguin to New Orleans and to the New Orleans Museum of Art, which was one of our primary venues. And they have two pieces in the collection. One of them is a glass door that was painted within a year of this painting, and it's in the collection there. So if we were going to use these 18 different venues, then how do you have conversations with those spaces? It couldn't just be about imposing an idea or an artist on the space, but what was the conversation that already existed there? And so NOMA, or the New Orleans Museum of Art, was founded in 1911, not far off, well, after Detroit Institute, of course. But it was part of that conversation towards us trying to understand each other and understand ourselves via culture when museums come into formation in this country. And that's part of a wider conversation. So you see that there. And then Tarsila, coming from a different place, but obviously involved in, I think, a counterpoint to that conversation. So these two artists kind of set a foundation in the oldest space of the exhibition. Moving into the initial room of the New Orleans Museum of Art, which is constructed in that very old architectural style. You walk into this giant hallway. It's not good for placing images or sculptures because it's a public place. It's an atrium. And so we had to think of ways to play in these corridors. And New Orleans Museum of Art happens to have a large gift of works by the artist Fred Brown. And Fred Brown is one of, I think, a few artists in the exhibition where it was like, I had seen the work for a while. It was somebody who's not a big part of the discussion, somebody who was a important part of a conversation around painting and specifically around neo-expressionism in the 80s, showed with Marlborough, but it was also an artist with a connection to New Orleans. So what you're seeing are these 3 of a dozen paintings that are all specifically about jazz and about the city of New Orleans. And so what better way in which to walk into that space? Upstairs, and thinking back around the conversation of how we were to come to a contemporary art tradition in this country, I was thinking about my own sort of interest and experience with the Museum of Modern Art, and thinking about a curator, director, Alfred Barr, and how so many of the exhibitions, if you look at the history of exhibitions at MoMA early on, they're predominantly about people. They're about trying to understand each other again. So you had exhibitions like Negro art, you had exhibitions pre-Columbian art, Native American art. It was the driving force for Barr of having a conversation around contemporary art. Of course, that gets lost in the wake of World War II and the ideas around abstract expressionism and all of that. But it was a foundational sort of conversation. Jeffrey Gibson, whose work you see here, looked specifically at a show that happened at MoMA in 1941 on Native American art. And he created an installation a couple years prior at a space in New York in which he remade some of the work from that show at MoMA. And you're seeing bits and pieces of that here. So it was a way to not only talk about a foundational art historical strategy, but a revision of that same art history. His friend Will Ryman outside, I think one of the things that a lot of people think about with the idea of a biennial exhibition is its presence within the city, and its presence outside, and its presence in terms of site specificity, and in terms of monument. And one of the things, I mean, as you can see from what I'm giving you at this point, is that I might have been a little bit more interested in a institutional conversation, and one that had a foundation more in the past than in a present. Of course, it's a contemporary art show, and we're getting to that, but I thought it was important to also have that conversation. And then another thing that, and this is still foundational. I think there's a point where I can run through the images more quickly, but part of the foundation was, on one hand, to address some of the larger ideas at the New Orleans Museum. So that idea of history and revising history. Another important conversation that could only happen there was a conversation around abstraction. And I'd say that there's a push-pull between abstraction and representation throughout the entire exhibition at every space. But here was the opportunity to have that conversation. And Alma Thomas, I think, is somebody, we're talking about her a lot more now, not only because of her presence in one of the rooms at the White House that was on Good Morning America, and sharing this space. I think her and Rauschenberger in one room together, but also an artist that who we're beginning to see a lot more of. And it was somebody where there is already a piece in the collection at the New Orleans Museum, and so we chose to build around that, and we added 3 more works from different moments in her career. Washington, D.C. based artist, often affiliated with color field artists, a very important body of work that mostly presides in the Smithsonian museums. And then another artist, Ed Clark. So how do we allow those conversations with artists to influence and come into the exhibition? And I think, one of the things, I think it's a conversation that probably comes up here too now, is for me, a lot of people were like, you're not from here, you don't know necessarily what's happening. And so it was about spending a lot of time on the ground early on, really just talking. And so there were connections that I felt needed to be made between artists who were there in the present, artists who were there in the past, and artists who had a foundation there. And Ed Clark was a foundational artist for me, born in 1926 in New Orleans, has made many works that are for him about New Orleans and about Louisiana. You see this is New Orleans series, there's a Louisiana series. So we combined works from those projects. And and thanks to George Anamdi, who I think is in here, we managed to put together a selection of works by Ed, who had this deep, deep presence in New Orleans. And furthered that conversation on abstraction, but also I think very pointedly reminds us of how do we look at abstraction versus representation. How is this a New Orleans series work versus just a abstract painting? And then you see him here, not only about him, but Ed had a very long and focused conversation with his dear friend Joan Mitchell. And the Joan Mitchell Foundation set up shop in New Orleans, so Joan Mitchell Residency was one of the venues. So there were all of these conversations that were part of that. And having spoken to Ed about that relationship and knowing that they had the painting in the collection, it was a way of trying to tease out some of those things. And I'm now moving into, moving into a little bit different phase. But part of the fun of these types of exhibitions, and one that is not the same as, say, doing a collection show at LACMA, is that idea of, again, the search and being surprised and finding new things and trying to figure out the ways in which they fit. So Huguette Caland was one of those surprises for me. I was at an exhibition opening for a younger artist in the exhibition, Tamika Norris, and a woman who worked at the gallery said, you should look at Huguette Caland. Turns out Huguette Caland, who was born in Lebanon in 1928, and she went to Paris at a certain point and worked in the fashion industry, but made these paintings beginning in the late 60s that became part of a big body of work that lasted around 15 years. And her studio and presence had actually been in Venice, in California, for many years, where her family owns a house. And she lived and she was part of the conversation, but like so many women artists that were part of that conversation in the early 80s in Los Angeles, you don't hear about her as much. And she was very close to Ed Moses, who we're showing at LACMA right now. So it was one of those artists where it was just one of those big surprises. And we did a small room of works by her, and I'm happy to say that the one on the left actually came into the collection. And then another foundational aspect of the exhibition, I can't tell you why it's doing that, was Jean-Michel Basquiat. And having worked on Basquiat as my thesis artist at Wesleyan, it's somebody that I think about and think through all the time. And it occurred to me that there were all of these ways in which his work fit perfectly into some of the ideas of the show and really led some of the ideas of the exhibition. Although born in Brooklyn in 1960, he was supremely focused on ideas about a sort of Afro-Atlantic tradition, and not only about that in a big general way, but in a really specific way. He did not spend a lot of time in the South, but the book, Flash of the Spirit by Robert Farris Thompson, was kind of like a Bible to him, and it was something that was always there in the studio after it came out in 1984. And in that book, Thompson, who is an Africanist scholar from Yale, talks about the tradition of West African culture as it is in the United States and elsewhere in the Americas. So Basquiat kind of, I think in some ways, came to this innately as a child born in Brooklyn to a Haitian father and a Puerto Rican mother, and was interested in some of those things. And then the book kind of exploded those ideas. So at first I thought it would be just, okay. All right. So you couldn't be more specific, even if you just take a quick glance at some of these paintings, but I thought it would be like 2 or 3 paintings in the exhibition as a whole, and it would just be an aspect you touch on. And then the director of the Ogden Museum of Art and our director, Brooke Anderson, thought it could be a bigger project. And it turned into a standalone exhibition by itself with its own book. And Robert Farris Thompson wrote a new piece in which he talked about his relationship with Basquiat in 1983 to 1985. Thompson was the first real writer to put Basquiat's work in a wider conversation than that was being used just as neo-expressionism or just of that moment. He really talked about things in a context that no one else had talked about. And we also got Robert O'Meally, who's a musicologist at Columbia and a former professor of mine, to write about it in terms of the musical context. So you're seeing 3 paintings here that are in the exhibition: Zydeco, King Zulu, and Eshu, and then within the space of the exhibition. Just for a moment here to point out how they address Zydeco is the music specifically from Southwest Louisiana. It is a part of that culture specifically. He's calling that out. Eshu in the bottom, taking that idea of spirituality in the Americas. How do you mix West African religion with Catholicism? It turns into all of these other syncretic religions, and Eshu being specifically a reference to Eshu Elegba, the trickster, or the god between life and death. And the one that O'Meally talks about the most is King Zulu, in which he breaks down how this painting is a New Orleans painting, and how King Zulu is a portrait of Louis Armstrong. Louis Armstrong was the king of the Zulu parade in 1941 in New Orleans. So very specific reasoning, and Armstrong considered that to be the height of his accomplishments. So this installation did a ton in terms of bringing forward some of the ideas. Also, one of the things that stayed with me in the conversations with artists was crime and punishment. And obviously, in the last 6 months, we're talking about that a whole lot. But Keith Calhoun and Chandra McCormick, who are from there, and I say crime and punishment because it was part of the conversations, but it was also something I obviously walked in with. A year before I started working on Prospect, I worked on a project in Mississippi. I paused to call it a biennial project. It was a small project about the state. And we specifically went around different parts of Mississippi and passed by Parchment, which is their big penitentiary, which is akin to Angola in Louisiana, where so many people have been put away wrongly, but also wrongly even if you had committed a crime. So that conversation obviously becoming more prominent again, we hope. But Keith and Chandra have been going in and out of Angola for the last 25 years and taking pictures. So we showed work going back to the 80s to the present, and also a video with a man who was recently released as part of the Innocence Project. So it was a big part of the conversation, and it moved forward in the work of an artist who was at the Ogden, and Herbert Singleton, whose work was in a room near Basquiat, but a guy who was born and raised in New Orleans and who actually was an inmate at Angola and actually not learned, but honed some of his craft while he was an inmate at Angola, and this being one of the more politically inclined works that he did that condemned what was happening there. And Singleton opened up a whole other conversation. What I might not have mentioned is that the Ogden is not just the Ogden, but it's the Ogden Museum of Southern Art, and it is one of the biggest collections of self-taught or vernacular art from the southeastern United States. So it has a very specific conversation. And at a certain point, I felt like that conversation could be seen in a much bigger way, but it kind of died down for me a little bit. It became a little bit less important after seeing Massimiliano Gioni's Venice Biennial, and the way that he's so really, really brilliantly used ideas around the self-taught and the vernacular in a very big international way, made it less important, I think, for us to focus on. You see another piece by Singleton. Okay, so we've gotten through the New Orleans Museum of Art and the Ogden Museum of Art, and now moving into the Contemporary Art Center. Those were the three biggest venues, and then in many ways the other 15 venues were much smaller or could be much more site-specifically used. So I'm going to try and run through these a little bit quicker and hope you have some questions. This is the entrance point to the Contemporary Art Center through the work of Lucia Koch. And going back to the ideas around abstraction and representation, it's a piece of, they're colored pieces of plexi that created a corner space of light that was really the entry point into the space from outside. And wanting to sort of, not shroud, but I don't know, embed the conversation a little bit within that first floor of this very, very large warehouse space that had 3 floors. Going on, Analia Saban in the back. Theaster Gates was also a part of that conversation and kind of moves the conversation from that space of a chromatic abstraction like Lucia Koch's work to a space of abstraction that is also full of content. I mean, you can't make a painting out of tar or a painting out of a fire hose and have it not be full of content. So that was the sort of backdrop of that first room. And then inside, which, and sorry for the image, Yunfei Ji, artist who had spent time in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina and did a series of scroll drawings that were taking that experience, but then overlaying it with his own experience with a flood in China. And so this idea of transposition of events and of experiences was something that was seen in a lot of the contemporary artists. And then you get a little bit better view. And Analia Saban, artist who, again, that idea of like who's from here, who's telling these stories. Analia, although from Buenos Aires, went to Loyola in New Orleans, and so spent a lot of time coming into her practice before moving out to Los Angeles, finding her own sort of body of work. And all of these pieces that you see here are made out of elements that come directly from the building. So, you know, the door that has been torn off, and then taking paint directly off of that door. You can see on the bottom of the door, that black part is then transposed onto the canvas next to it. And the sort of color on the painting on the right comes from the sink below it, and vice versa. So this idea of an abstraction that is sort of generating itself. David Zinke, you're going to see a little bit later. But that question of abstraction was one that what traveled up into the second floor and then sort of dissolved away after the work of 2 artists. One on the left, you can see a painting by Hayal Pazanti, and then on the right, MacArthur Binion. And so after this space, the conversation changed a lot. And MacArthur Binion, have Cranbrook alum. Douglas Bourgeois, artist from New Orleans. These paintings are all specifically about the people of the city. You better look there. And then Sophie Lavoff. And these are some of the images that actually document the moviegoer and different neighborhoods in the moviegoer. Glenn Kino, an artist who I think that idea of people seeing each other and thinking about the ways in which that applies in the natural world. Glenn is, I think, one of a couple of artists in the exhibition that I spoke to very early on and asked him to just keep this in mind, to make a consideration. He's an artist, I think, like a couple of others in the show, where he's trying to literally make magic or believes in some sort of alchemy. And he came up with this idea of looking at coral, these very specific coral that are sort of attacking each other and trying to take over each other's space. And so he's grown them on these parts of discarded military tanks. And so these are all living and changed during the duration of the exhibition. Lisa Seagull, an artist who had to do a lot of, I think, community conversations in mind with this project. And it's impossible. It's one of those projects where it's impossible to tell you what went into it and what, in a way, was the essence of the piece. And I think that's a large part of these types of shows, is that some things can only be experienced. And so for Lisa, she took a series of texts by Suzanne Laurie Parks that actually come from Suzanne's project on writing a play a day for 365 days, and used parts of the text on these abandoned houses. And the navigation that she had to make in order to make this project with the people who were squatting there and the people who were part of that neighborhood was a very interesting one, to say the least. And it's also one of those projects that has a life beyond the exhibition, in that it has also become attached to another nonprofit that continues to sort of revitalize this neighborhood. Works here documenting the Mississippi River, and also Charles Gaines. And this image does nothing for the piece. It's a time-based piece that when the room is completely dark, it shows you the night sky and the constellation of the night sky as it is represented by the specific dates of 3 or 4 different pieces of text, going back to the 17th century with Gerard Winstanley, and that being one of the first texts of civil disobedience, going through work by Senghor and also Ho Chi Minh. So this very sort of poetic time-based piece. And then moving upstairs, which in a way I think became a sort of Tower of Babel, if you will. On the right is Enteng Wiharso, and then straight ahead is Agus Suwage, 2 artists from Indonesia. And both of them bringing, I think, some of the reference points to an older conversation, and one that relates to vernacular art from Southeast Asia. And you see that here, and this is also has sound element to it as well. And then there's kind of a conversation between film and video that happens with this artist Pushpamala and another artist, where she's talking specifically about the history of film in Bollywood and inserting herself into these different images as a character in these films. And on the other side, Peter Hugo, who's dealing with Nollywood. So this reference point of film and video, of movie going, was something that was there throughout many of the contemporary artists on view, but also happened really specifically here and around ideas of how much Hollywood is a bit player in an international conversation. And Manal Al-Dawayan, artist from Saudi Arabia, whose project is all about Saudi Aramco and actually demonstrating the people who worked for Saudi Aramco and showing them as that corporation became the sort of driving force in that country. Zarina Bemg, an artist who has been totally involved in a conversation around East Africa and conversations around a colonial history, specifically in Uganda and Kenya. She had done 2 projects about that space, and this is an artist who was born to Indian parents in Uganda and left under Amin, And in this project, she's kind of reflecting, I think, very quietly on that landscape. Mary Ellen Carroll, one of several artists who was working on the ground in New Orleans, and this became sort of a big history of New Orleans and of television and of the distribution of news channels in New Orleans. Mary Ellen had the idea of doing super Wi-Fi in a neighborhood that still was did not have Wi-Fi. So this bringing something to people that could be useful. And you see a better view. And then Kerry James Marshall. Kerry, for this project, wanting to do something completely different. And in this installation, bringing presents to the children who were not allowed to go to this store. It's actually done in a department store window. Carrie Mae Weems, artist who had done a lot of projects in New Orleans in the past, and so was somebody who was a real go-to. And then Hugh Locke, who was part of a bigger conversation around ideas of the carnivalesque that happened at the Newcomb Gallery at Tulane. And these are all made out of beads. That idea of Mardi Gras, that idea of carnival, that idea of adornment was something that was also quite important to this space. And here, Andrea Frazier, and this piece is called Discarded Fantasies. It's a work in which she learned how to samba in Brazil, and what you're seeing is the discarded clothes after Carnival. So obviously, you know, the question between Carnival and Mardi Gras is something that's always there, but Andrea really taking that to a huge degree, and this piece was in the middle of a room surrounded by mirror works by Monier Farman Fermayan. And you see a better view there. And then Ebony Patterson from Jamaica, big decorative paintings, also talking about these ideas around the carnivalesque. And then you have projects where you don't know exactly what is happening, like Piero Golia, who has been making a mold of George Washington's nose from Mount Rushmore. And it was a way to get people involved. It was at the Delgado community where you also had a lot of students who were working with him. And so it became this very interactive project. And Camille Henro, and I'm going to show you a clip in a minute, so I'm going to pass. And so now these are some of the single spaces. And William Cordova, another artist that was involved from the very beginning, who had spent a lot of time in New Orleans and really knew and wanted to talk about histories of architecture there. Here he is, and I think William must be quite happy this week. In this piece, he had a brass band facing off against Robert E. Lee at Robert E. Lee Circle. And of course, now we hear that the mayor wants to have this statue torn down as of this week. Terri Adkins, another big artist for me who was really important from the beginning, who had these works in New Orleans and who passed while we were working on the exhibition. His sort of reference points between music and sculpture and the way that he has used sculpture as musical instruments is also a heart of the project. One of the things you'll get a little bit at the end, what I'm not conveying is how much I think music provided a backdrop. And one of the things that we did, in addition to having that quote at every venue, was we also had a music list that was provided by a DJ from New Orleans, and also a poem that was made by a young New Orleans artist. Lonnie Hawley would have furthered that conversation in a big way around self-taught art and some of those ideas, but we ended up with this amazing installation in which Lonnie came down for about 3 weeks and created this entire installation at the Xavier University venue. And then Zarui Abdalian, artist, again, from New Orleans, but not living there, living in San Francisco, and an artist who who you can see how important it is in terms of speaking about location when it is someone who is speaking from experience. Having grown up there, I think she had a real sense of nuance for the atmosphere and created a very lightly and touched and nimble installation at the African American Museum, which closed in the process of making the exhibition. We would have had work inside the building, but instead, dealing with what happened, she created this piece that was sort of sound installation in the garden and the yard around these buildings that date back to the mid-19th century. And then Remy Youngerman, artist from Suriname, and in some ways pointing back towards a more art historical conversation, say, with his Dutch past, and thinking of an artist like Mondrian obviously comes to mind, but he's also mixing in elements of Maroon culture and its position in Suriname. And then Tamika Norris, and an artist who lived there in New Orleans, who created a film while living there specifically for the exhibition. So there were probably about a dozen works that were created specifically from there or with the space in mind. And then the Propeller Group, and I'm going to show you a clip. And Andrea Fraser, if anything could have gone so specifically to what I had in mind, I guess initially, would be Andrea's project. And it is a piece where not only did she do the sculptural project, which gives you a sense of how she considers herself as a participant in the creation of work. As I mentioned, she danced with a samba school. But she came to New Orleans a few times, and we could not find, what she wanted to do was she wanted to act out a text that would talk about how people see each other in the city. And we could not find the perfect text until about a month before we opened. And she came up with this transcript that was part of a transcript that happened in 1991 that basically was the court hearing that desegregated the Mardi Gras floats. And yes, we couldn't believe that it only happened in 1991, but it's New Orleans. And that was, a really important. I can't think of another project that specifically took on that element of location so specifically. One of the first places I went in even walking there was, you can't help it because it's very close to the art school, is the corner of Press and Royal Streets. And that corner is where Homer Plessy was arrested in, 1892. 2 years after Louisiana's act that specifies that you can't be in the same train car if you're of different race. And so, he was part of this larger group of citizens from Treme who did a very, it was pure civil disobedience. Everything was completely set up for him to be arrested. And of course, that becomes our landmark 1896 case, Supreme Court case, which says basically that you must live apart. You can, segregation is the law of the land. And that doesn't change until Supreme Court 1954, of course, Brown versus Board of Education in Topeka. It took 6 years for Brown versus Board of Education to affect New Orleans. So 1960, Ruby Bridges goes to school. Of course, I remember first seeing the image from the Norman Rockwell painting that so immortalizes her. But it took 6 years for that to happen in New Orleans. So that was also the backdrop of The Moviegoer. I talk about it in a very broad brushstroke, abstract kind of way, but you're talking about a book that is on the streets of New Orleans, created in 1961, so just to have a sense of the background. So, of course, 30 years later, in that context, isn't so much. Andrea has the incredible ability to take on different characters in one performance. So she basically did an hour-long performance in which she spoke and acted out the voices of about 8 characters from this landmark court case that desegregated the floats from Mardi Gras. Gary Simmons, we had to end on a party. As I said, music was an integral element of the exhibition. He created this piece at a place called the Treme Market Branch, which was one of the scary things about working on an exhibition like this is you actually don't know in some cases what's going to happen at certain venues. And Gary started out off at a boxing ring that was no longer in use, and then somebody sold the building, of course, because that's what happens now in New Orleans. And probably that's what's happening in Detroit a little bit, I imagine. So we lost 3 venues with Gary, and we found this venue at the last month before opening, and he created the floor piece and the sound system to go with it. And it was sort of consecrated by a poet, a guy named Beans, who kind of had the opening weekend closing party. And you see him here. And one of the things I think that became one of the sort of trademark works of the exhibition was this work by Tavares Strawn, You Belong Here, which he had done prior as a neon that was maybe this big, and then blew it up to 30-something feet. And not only that, because it's Tavares, who like Glenn Kynell wants to imagine large, decided that it had to be on a barge in the Mississippi, and not only that, but that it had to move, which cost a lot of money to get somebody to move the barge up and down the Mississippi every night. So there were times when it was just docked, but it really did become this sort of iconic image for the show. It also reminded me, and something that I thought about a lot and probably learned a lot about from Maurizio, was images and how images are the way that we often see things now. Because of Tavares and the support structure that he's created and that we were able to latch on to, so many people saw this image because of social media, even if they didn't see the piece in person. And I think a lot of people think that they know it because of that, which was nice. And I'm just going to show you a couple of quick clips, if I can figure it out. Okay, this is going to suffice.
C'était très rapide et qu'il y avait plusieurs images en même temps. Je ne savais pas si un esprit humain allait trouver ça agréable d'être confronté à autant d'informations aussi rapidement. Il est construit sur une recherche Google. Enfin, moi, avant de tourner les images, j'ai fait des folders avec tout un tas d'images à trouver.
The history of the world. It's a piece, one of the few pieces that existed somewhere else, and this was part of the Venice Biennial prior. But in Camille Henrot's show, trying to do the history of the world basically from the vantage point of one's desktop.
Et puis aussi, c'est important que ce soit une expérience physique. Pendant que je faisais la recherche au Smithsonian, j'ai collecté un certain nombre de mythes de la création, donc Sioux, Navajo, Inuit, Shinto, Tien, c'est un nombre assez important. Et puis je les ai un peu comparés entre eux, j'ai essayé d'établir une sorte de structure qui permettrait de les articuler tous ensemble au sein d'un même récit, bien que évidemment les choses n'arrivent pas dans le même ordre selon les histoires de création du monde. Parfois Dieu arrive.
So just one of the ways of trying to think about history as this sort of creative fiction, and essentially Camille was on a residency at the Smithsonian and going through archives when she created this piece. And there's an incredible music backdrop, which you only can get a little bit of in the background, as it is an installation to be experienced. And there's impossible to give the same thing here. And lastly, so that was part of a large installation on the second floor, that if one had gone to the right before the abstract paintings, it would have been right there. And it was a complete sound immersion, and you're just getting a B version of what it would sound like. But it was this practice for him as a musician and creating music with people he did not know. And part of the experience with David was he had this experience from this film that he made with Afro-Cuban musicians, but then also being in New Orleans, and he participated in a lot of the music that was happening there. And he's as much a musician as he is an artist, which was a big part of, I think, the experience. And thank you. Thank you. So if you have any questions, let me know.
You spoke of the artists as some vernacular. You seem to have different categories. I know Lonnie Holly has said that he sees himself as an artist. But as a curator, I see different perspectives.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that?
Sure.
I don't know if it's too often. It's not good.
No, I mean, that's something I'm dealing with now with Purefoy. I think vernacular because I think of where it comes from, and I think of the context of it coming specifically from something that is lived, as opposed to something that is perhaps more learned. But it's hard. I don't know, I don't know what the perfect terminology is at this point. I see it all as just artists. The way I talk to Lonnie is just artists. And I was also part of his conversation also influenced me in wanting to pull back from that conversation. It was one that you could have, and the next curator might have it in a big way there. Because also one of the first things that people say when you work on a project like this in New Orleans is, how can you make a project an art project if it's not about music or if it's not about food? And, so it was like, I felt like, okay, we got to get past that first. And then the other conversation is part of the fact that it is such a lived culture, that it is a culture that is lived on the street, literally, that it becomes less important to make these differences. And so I try not to. I mean, I do, I guess, for the sake of conversation, but I try to look at it all as just the same thing. Oh, no, no, no.
But that's, it's not just you, but other curators certainly just calling it just art.
Well, I think the beautiful thing about Massimiliano's show and why I made why I said international was because that when we think of self-taught in the United States, we might think black, we might think southeastern United States, but it's not. Yes, no, of course, but that's but it's a wider conversation, as you're pointing to, and as I think that exhibition did brilliantly. Where he began with this work of Italian-American Ariti, and Rodi is a part of that conversation too. So it's bigger, and it's something I grapple with a lot. I mean, we have right now a wall of work in a 50th anniversary show with Herbert Singleton, Robert Rauschenberg. I'm forgetting. I think Sister Corita Kent is in there. So it's a big conversation. I'm glad you bring that up. It's one that we continue to address. Sam Doyle.
See, I saw Dan Cameron talk, and it's interesting, he doesn't see a difference in them at all. It's just one of the things that I find interesting today.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, I think it goes back and forth. Like ever since we've had this idea of the the outsider art fair, and ever since there's been a marketplace, and now that marketplace is heating up once again, that it becomes more of something that people try to grapple with, and it feels like every 5-6 years, like I use the reference point of the New York Times because I grew up with that. But like Roberta Smith will write an article every 5 or 6 years that says we need to stop calling these people outsiders. And it happens for a little bit and a little bit and a little bit. I think it's changing. Thank you. Thank you. Hey.
You as a writer first or curator, and I'm just curious, how much and how does language factor into the way you approach curatorial writing?
Thanks, Michelle. A lot in this case. That was, for me, I find that to be the base as a foundation for myself. Like, I began writing, and then, at Flash Art, it's like, how can you take this idea and turn it into an essay? And then the essay is the show. So I have to go through that. And in this case of trying to think through ideas, it's not like working within the context of the institution where I can tell you how all of what drives, for the most part, every exhibition. Purifoy is driven by the fact that this is an artist that was an integral part of Los Angeles who people still don't know of. Not only do they not know him well in LA, and they don't know him outside. Exhibitions that are based off of collections. But in this case, it's that wide open space. And from where do we choose or try to find an entry point? And that's the way for me to enter in. And so thus those big books that I think are so open to interpretation in some ways, it's integral. Wait, point to what? I don't know. I think, we're all driven by our moment. And so I work in an encyclopedic museum, but I work in this context of contemporary. So it's constantly driven by that moment. And we're trying to address that. It just so happens that we can't plan it, but Purifoy in this case is an artist who's he tried to balance a sense of activism with a sense of art making his entire life. He had a social worker's degree from Atlanta, and then he went to CalArts. And then he became the co-founder of the Art Center at Watts Towers. And he worked specifically with kids, he worked specifically with people about using art as a catalyst for some other conversation, to take us somewhere else. And he did that successfully for a while until he saw 1965. And he made a big work out of it called 66 Signs of Neon, which traveled to 9 different places around the country. And then after working back in Watts and not seeing anything change from 65, he stopped making work in 73 for the next 13 years. So it just so happens that that's the exhibition that is up right now. It'll help us think about the next shows or the next conversation. It sure changes the way that the exhibition on the second floor beneath it looks, which is a show of drawings from the 60s and 70s in LA. And it makes you question who's there and who's not there. So I don't know if that answers the question, but I think it moves with it.
I felt like you sort of framed perspectives as being a driver for regeneration post-Katrina, and I was wondering if you had specific outcomes or expectations of what that looks like, the effort to regenerate, the show itself or some other outcome.
Yeah, well, so this was the third iteration. The first one was, 2000? And so you've had 2, and you have the foundation. And so by Dan Cameron, who founded it, did the first 2. And so then I was kind of free from that conversation, I think, in some ways. Not totally, but in many ways. And oftentimes had to say, this is not a post-Katrina show, although, it gets addressed here and there. But one of the ways that it guided us was that we had to try and think about something being left behind. And because of there being an executive director in place right now who's really amazing, it's on firm footing, and people are really behind it now, I think, in a way that, is hard initially because of the economics of the situation. And not, people weren't impressed to have reviews in Art Forum and reviews in the New York Times. It was what does it do, though? And so I mentioned the project with Lisa Seagull, and then there's also a project with Theaster Gates that it wasn't just the paintings, but he had an entrepreneurial project that he's engaged in with a nonprofit there called Ashe, which is a real community-run organization. And so it's a small entrepreneurial program that provides seed money for taxi drivers. It's not a ton, but it's real, it's specific. People can get something from it. And, in some ways, I wish there were a few more of those. But I think next time, Trevor Schoonmaker is doing the project, we'll leave something else. It'll get built upon. Tough question. I can only speak from my experience, is that the artist conversation has got to be the basis of it. And what we have tried to stress, at least in the last 5.5 years, well, I'd say 7, since my director, Michael Govan, came 2006. So what was that, almost 9 years? Is that we have to not only be encyclopedic and talk about that international scope or whatever scope, but that we have to also do it from the vantage point of our location. And so recently I had an abstract painting exhibition that was up. I'd say 40% of the artists were from LA. It can be easy to do in the context, or easier in the context of having so many schools there with so many MFA programs, too many. But it makes it a little bit easier. For us, the driving force behind contemporary within the museum is how do artists, how do we work together to reflect upon the past? So if we're going to be encyclopedic and be different than MOCAD over there or different from the Hammer over there, what is the resonance with the rest of the collection? So like we have a work up right now by a woman named Yoo-Sik Young, Korean artist. I think she's in her early 50s. And it's a work that is displayed in the same space of Korean antiquities, although it was made 4 or 5 years ago. It's made out of porcelain that has been glued back together. So it's kind of about the past and breaking the past, literally, but putting it back together. And it's a great conversation with some of the moon jars and other things that are coming from the same aesthetic. Same thing with us. It's kind of weird, and I think we can get away with some things that other encyclopedic museums that are, well, everything is East, but some encyclopedic museums where your tradition is so much longer, if we think about the DIA. Our museum's only been there since 1965, so you can't come to us and expect to see the great things that you see here or Chicago or New York. So I'm free, and I can reflect upon the little things that we do have. You know, we have a room of modern paintings. I don't think it's changed since I got there, and there's not enough great work to replace it. So we concentrate on the other parts, and we concentrate on film and video because of our proximity. And so a work like Christian Marclay's The Clock is a piece we had to have, and it'll be on view again next week. But being driven by strength. We have a great collection of South and Southeast Asian because of some of the past collectors. And so that's why part of the reason August Suwage and Enteng Waharso, who were in Prospect, are both in the LACMA collection. And so we try to build there too. So how do we see the art of the past through the present? If you go into the pre-Columbian galleries, you have to go through Jorge Pardo. You don't come in through the past, you come in through the present. Thank you. Thank you.